The morning sun crept over the rolling prairie, bleeding red and gold across the endless sky. Ashwood lay silent beneath that light, a town that wore its scars like old soldiers wore their medals. Wind skittered down the empty main street, carrying the smell of horses, wood smoke, and dust that clung to everything like a memory. Evelyn Carter stood on her porch, shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For months she had lived in this uneasy calm, keeping her ranch afloat with the grit her late husband once admired. She had almost convinced herself that the worst was over. The sound of hooves shattered that fragile peace. A boy, no older than 15, came thundering up the road, his hat flying behind him, eyes wide with urgency. He reined in hard, gravel scattering from his horse's hooves as he jumped down, clutching a folded telegram. His face was pale and his voice cracked when he spoke. "Ma'am, they told me to bring this straight to you. Said it's important." Evelyn's heart lurched. She hadn't received a telegram since her husband's funeral 2 years ago. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the yellowed slip of paper, the black ink smudged from hurried writing. It was a single sentence, no signature. "He wasn't who you thought he was." The words sank into her chest like a stone in deep water. She blinked hard, reading it again and again, as if a different meaning might appear. But the weight of it was undeniable. Whoever had sent this knew something about Thomas Carter, something she hadn't dared question since the night his blood stained their doorstep. She dismissed the boy with a trembling thank you and stepped back inside, her boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. The cabin felt colder suddenly, shadows lengthening in corners, though the morning had barely begun. She reached for her husband's old Bible, the one she kept on the mantel. Her hand hesitated over its worn leather cover. That book held his letters, his promises. Now she wondered if it also held his lies. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the windows. The boy's horse clopped away, fading into silence. Evelyn sank into the rocking chair by the fire, telegram clutched in her lap, heart pounding. She thought of Thomas's smile, his rough hands, the way he'd sworn to keep her safe in this unforgiving land. "Who were you really?" she whispered, voice breaking. The day had only just begun, but something in her bones told her life in Ashwood would never be the same. A storm was coming, one that would strip away every illusion she had left. The town of Ashwood. Ashwood sat at the edge of two worlds, the old one built on lawlessness, and the new one creeping in with the railroad's whistle. From a distance, the town looked like a sun-baked scar etched into the prairie. Its single main street was lined with weather-beaten buildings, a saloon with a swinging sign that creaked in the wind, a general store with boarded windows, a livery stable that smelled of hay and sweat, and a sheriff's office whose peeling paint betrayed years of neglect. Evelyn Carter guided her wagon into town later that morning, the telegram tucked tightly in her pocket. The journey was short, but every turn of the wagon wheels felt heavy, as if the prairie itself was reluctant to let her go. She'd grown up on these plains, seen the town through droughts and cattle drives, through Indian raids and the arrival of settlers from every corner of the world. Ashwood was a place of survivors, and she was one of them. Samuel Carter, her younger brother, emerged from the livery as she pulled up. At 20, Samuel was wiry, restless, and too quick with his temper. He grinned when he saw her, but there was tension behind his smile. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Evie," he said, taking the reins. "Just tired," she lied, brushing past him. She wasn't ready to share the telegram. Not with Samuel, not with anyone. Not yet. Inside the general store, Evelyn's presence drew quiet glances. Folks respected her strength. Many pitied her widowhood. Whispers followed her like shadows, but she ignored them, her eyes scanning the dusty shelves for supplies. The shopkeeper, a kindly man named Mr. Whitaker, greeted her with a nod. "Morning, Mrs. Carter. Sheriff Pike was asking after you earlier." Her stomach tightened. Sheriff Luther Pike was a tall, broad man with a slow drawl and a gaze like sharpened steel. He had been Thomas's friend once, and Evelyn trusted him, until now, when trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She found Pike leaning against the post outside his office, hat tipped low. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. "Everything all right at the ranch?" "Fine," she replied, forcing a smile. Pike's eyes lingered a moment too long, as if searching for something in her face. She felt exposed beneath his gaze. As she climbed back onto the wagon, Samuel returned, carrying a coil of rope. "You should have stayed home," he muttered. "Townsfolk are wound tight these days. Trouble's brewing." Evelyn looked around. The boarded windows, the grim faces, the distant sound of a train whistle. Trouble wasn't brewing, it was already here, and she could feel its weight pressing down on Ashwood like a storm cloud ready to burst. The stranger's arrival. Late that afternoon, Ashwood's saloon doors swung open with a groan, letting in a gust of hot prairie wind and a man who looked like he'd ridden through hell to get here. The piano fell silent mid-tune as heads turned. Rafe Callahan stepped inside, his duster coat trailing dust behind him, his hat shadowing sharp, tired features. He carried himself like a man who'd seen too much, his boots heavy on the floorboards, spurs jingling softly with each step. Evelyn was at the bar speaking with the barkeep, her basket of supplies at her feet. She stiffened as she caught sight of him. Rafe's presence was a disruption, the kind Ashwood didn't welcome. The saloon's usual noise dimmed to whispers. A pair of Crane's hired guns, stationed at a corner table, straightened at the sight of the stranger. Rafe scanned the room slowly, his eyes lingering on Evelyn like he'd been looking for her all along. With unhurried confidence, he strode to her table and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice deep and calm, "I've been meaning to meet you." Evelyn blinked, startled that this man knew her name. "Do I know you?" she asked cautiously. "Not yet." He reached into his coat, and hands twitched near holsters around the room. But instead of a gun, Rafe set a small leather journal on the bar. "This belonged to your husband." Evelyn's breath hitched. She reached for the journal with trembling fingers. The leather was cracked, familiar. She hadn't seen it since before Thomas was killed. Rafe's expression softened, though his eyes carried the weight of bad news. "I think you'll find something worth reading," he murmured before turning to leave. The tension in the saloon thickened as Crane's men watched him go, muttering under their breath. Evelyn clutched the journal, her heart pounding. Something about this man, his calm, the respect in his tone, felt both dangerous and reassuring. She hurried out behind him, but by the time she stepped into the glaring sun, Rafe was already gone, swallowed by Ashwood's dusty streets. That night, Evelyn sat by lamplight, the journal open on her kitchen table. She skimmed the pages until her eyes froze on one, marked with a folded scrap of paper. Page 37. Her stomach knotted as she read Thomas's handwriting. It wasn't just ranch records, it was a confession. Names, places, deals with Silas Crane. Blood spilled for land. Evelyn's hand shook as she dropped the book. Wind rattled the shutters. A coyote howled in the distance. The truth was clawing its way out of the past, and Rafe Callahan had just opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to step through. A forbidden bond. The next few days passed under an uneasy sky. Evelyn worked her ranch with steady hands, but her mind was elsewhere, on the journal, on Thomas's confessions, and on the stranger who carried them to her doorstep. Rafe Callahan was a name whispered now in town, half the saloon claiming he was a hired gun, the other half insisting he'd once been a lawman. Evelyn didn't know which to believe. She only knew that when he rode past her fence line one evening, slow and deliberate, something in her chest stirred, and she hated herself for feeling it. He dismounted near her gate, tipping his hat politely. "Didn't mean to spook you, Mrs. Carter," he said. his voice calm as the prairie wind. "Just figured I'd check if you read that page." "I did," she replied, her words sharper than she intended. She crossed her arms. "Where'd you get it?" "From a man who didn't live long enough to finish telling the story," Rafe said grimly, his gaze holding hers. "Your husband's dealings weren't just with Crane. There's more to that land you're standing on than you know." His words sent a chill through her, but Evelyn didn't show it. She glanced toward the barn where Samuel was working. "You should go," she said softly. "People will talk if they see you here." "Let them talk," Rafe muttered, mounting his horse again. "You've got bigger problems than gossip." That night, gossip did swirl. At the saloon, Crane's men whispered over whiskey, their eyes glinting with suspicion. Silas Crane himself, a thick-set man with silver hair and a cruel smile, had begun making offers to ranchers. Lowball offers backed by threats. Folks said he meant to control the valley before the railroad expansion came through. Evelyn's ranch, sitting square on the most fertile patch, was the prize he wanted most. As dusk fell the next evening, Rafe appeared again, this time in town. Evelyn spotted him leaning against a lamppost outside the general store, his hat low over his eyes. The sight of him drew stares and whispers, but she felt something else. Relief. She didn't trust him, but she trusted even less the world closing in around her. Later, she found herself sitting across from him, in the saloon's dim back corner, lantern light flickering over his face. His words were measured, his voice low. "You need to be ready. Crane's not a man who negotiates, he takes." Evelyn stared into her drink, her hand trembling. "And why do you care what happens to me?" Rafe's jaw tightened. "Because I owe someone who once cared about you." The weight of his words settled between them like a loaded gun. The hidden letter. The wind howled over the plains that night, rattling the shutters of Evelyn's cabin, as if warning her of what she was about to find. She had been pacing for hours, the journal open on the table, Rafe's words echoing in her mind. Something in her gut told her there was more than what that single page revealed, more than what she'd been willing to see in Thomas's eyes when he came home late, with dust on his boots and a shadow over his soul. Evelyn found herself standing before the mantel, her hands hovering over the worn leather Bible Thomas had always kept there. Her fingers traced the gold-embossed lettering, faded from years of use. She lifted it carefully, flipping through pages yellowed with time. A folded envelope slipped free, landing at her feet. Her breath caught. Kneeling, she picked it up, her hands trembling as she broke the brittle seal. Inside was a letter in Thomas's familiar scrawl, dated months before his death. "Evie, if you're reading this, it means things have gone wrong. I wanted to give you everything, this land, a safe home, a future. But the truth is, I took it from others. Crane offered me a way out, but there's blood on this soil, and I fear it will follow us. Protect Samuel, protect yourself." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She pressed the letter to her chest, her heart aching with betrayal and grief. She had built her life on this ranch, poured every ounce of herself into it, believing it was her family's redemption. Now it felt like a graveyard of promises. Samuel's voice startled her from behind. "Evie, what's wrong?" He stood in the doorway, shirt half-buttoned, worry etched on his young face. She quickly folded the letter, shoving it into her pocket. "Nothing you need to worry about," she whispered, forcing a weak smile. But Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You're keeping secrets like you did when Pa died." "Go to bed, Sam," she said sharply, her voice breaking. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until she understood the full truth. Later that night, she sat alone by the window, lantern light flickering over her pale face as she stared out at the dark prairie. The letter burned in her pocket like a brand, and Rafe's warning echoed in her mind. Crane wasn't coming to bargain. He was coming to claim what Thomas had taken, and Evelyn knew this time blood would be spilled again. Outside, a coyote cried, its wail carrying across the plains like a lament. Evelyn whispered into the empty room, "Lord, help us," because she knew she'd just uncovered a truth that could tear the town apart. A town-divided Ashwood awoke under a heavy sky, the sun veiled by thin clouds that turned the streets a dull, lifeless gray. Evelyn rode into town that morning, Samuel at her side, both silent as their horses clopped over the cracked boards of the bridge leading in. The air felt different, charged, restless. Men stood in clusters outside the saloon, hats low, murmuring as Crane's hired guns lounged in doorways, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The balance of power had shifted overnight. It was written in every nervous glance, every shuttered window. Sheriff Pike stood on the boardwalk, his arms folded, expression unreadable as always. Evelyn dismounted and approached him. "You're letting him take over," she accused softly, voice low enough for only him to hear. Pike tipped his hat back, his calm gaze fixed on her. "Ain't my place to pick sides in a war, Mrs. Carter. Law's thin out here. I keep the peace the best I can." "Peace?" Evelyn's voice trembled with anger. "They're threatening families, Luther. Folks are scared to leave their homes. Is that your peace?" Pike's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His silence felt heavier than words, and it chilled her. Samuel shifted beside her, restless, glancing at the men leaning against the saloon's porch rail. Evelyn followed his gaze, suspicion flickering in her gut. He'd been disappearing more often lately, his excuses thin. She grabbed his arm, whispering sharply, "What are you mixed up in, Sam?" He jerked away, guilt flashing in his eyes before he masked it with a scoff. "I'm trying to keep us alive, Evie. You think Pike's gonna save us? Or Callahan? No one's coming. Crane owns this town now." Her heart sank. Samuel's words carried a bitterness she'd never heard before. That afternoon, tension boiled over when a rancher named Elias Ward refused to sell his land to Crane. Gunfire shattered the quiet, echoing down Ashwood's single street. Evelyn watched from her wagon as Ward's body was carried out of the saloon, blood seeping through a blanket. Crane himself appeared moments later, tipping his silver-trimmed hat as if nothing had happened, his cold eyes scanning the crowd. "This valley is changing," Crane announced, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I'm offering fair deals. Take 'em or leave empty-handed." The message was clear. Resistance meant death. Evelyn's stomach churned as Pike stood motionless, saying nothing. That night, as she rode home with Samuel, she caught him glancing nervously at the horizon, where a single rider watched them from a ridge, Rafe Callahan. His presence was both a comfort and a warning. Trouble was no longer coming. It was here, wearing Crane's smile and Samuel's fear. Blood on the prairie. The sky was still dark when the first gunshot split the silence of Evelyn's ranch. She bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the rifle propped against the wall. Samuel was already awake, face pale, his boots half pulled on as he peered out the window. The orange glow of torches flickered against the barn, shadows moving like ghosts in the night. "They're here," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling. Evelyn's stomach turned to ice. She could hear the voices of men outside, rough and mocking, and the clang of a gate being forced open. Silas Crane's threat had come sooner than she expected. She moved quickly, loading her rifle, while Samuel hesitated by the door, his hands shaking. "Stay here," she hissed, but Samuel shook his head, jaw clenched in defiance. The front door burst open before either of them could move. Rafe Callahan stormed in, revolver in hand, his eyes sharp and alert. "Back window," he barked. "They're surrounding the house." Evelyn didn't argue. She grabbed Samuel's arm, but he wrenched free. "No," Samuel shouted. I have to stop this." He bolted out the back before Evelyn could catch him. Panic clawed at her throat. Rafe cursed under his breath, pulling her towards the kitchen exit. "Come on, Evelyn. He made his choice." Gunfire erupted outside, echoing across the prairie like thunder. Evelyn's breath came fast and shallow as Rafe led her into the shadows behind the house. They crouched low, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Men shouted orders, and a torch was hurled at the barn, flames licking up its dry walls. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out, Samuel's. "Stop shooting! It's me!" Evelyn's heart stopped. She peeked around the corner to see her brother standing in the open, hands raised, calling out to Crane's men. But instead of stopping, a rifle cracked and Samuel crumpled to the ground. "Sam!" Evelyn screamed, breaking from cover. Rafe grabbed her, holding her back as bullets peppered the dirt around them. "You'll die too," he growled. She thrashed against him, sobbing as Rafe dragged her behind a water trough for cover. When the shooting slowed, Rafe slipped into the chaos, firing back with deadly precision. Evelyn crawled to Samuel's side, cradling him in her arms. His blood soaked her hands, warm and slick. He coughed weakly, his lips trembling as he whispered, "Evie, it wasn't bandits. Pike killed Thomas to save lives." His eyes glazed over before she could respond. The world spun. Betrayal and grief slammed into her like a bullet. She clutched Samuel's body, the fire's glow painting the night red. Somewhere behind her, Rafe's voice cut through the chaos. "We have to go now!" The reckoning. The night was thick with smoke and sorrow when Rafe led Evelyn back into Ashwood, her hands still stained with Samuel's blood. She rode in silence, tears streaking her dust-caked face, clutching her rifle like a lifeline. The streets were eerily quiet. The townsfolk hid behind shuttered windows, pretending not to hear the distant gunfire that had raged on her land. Rafe dismounted outside the sheriff's office and tied his horse with steady hands. "You stay out here," he said, voice firm but soft. "No." Evelyn's voice was hoarse, trembling but resolute. "He killed my husband, Rafe. I'll hear it from his own mouth." Inside, the office smelled of tobacco and old leather. Sheriff Pike sat behind his desk, lantern light flickering across his weathered face. He looked up slowly, his eyes shadowed with something that wasn't guilt but weariness, a man already carrying his own noose. "I was wondering when you'd come," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. Evelyn stormed forward, slamming Samuel's bloodied bandana onto his desk. "You killed Thomas," she spat, her voice cracking. "You shot my husband, and now my brother is dead because of this cursed land." Pike's jaw clenched. He reached for a bottle, poured himself a drink, and swallowed it in one gulp before speaking. "Your husband was gonna slaughter a village," he said quietly. "A settlement of Cheyenne folks. Women, children. Crane paid him to clear the land." His voice was calm but heavy, each word like a hammer blow. "I tried to talk him down. He wouldn't stop, so I stopped him." Evelyn staggered back, her world spinning. Thomas, the man she loved, the man who promised to protect her, had been planning a massacre. She shook her head violently. "You're lying," she whispered. "I wish I was," Pike said, his voice hollow. "Thomas wasn't the man you thought he was, Evie. Crane used him, same as he's using everyone. I did what I had to do, and I'll answer to God for it." Rafe's hand rested gently on Evelyn's shoulder, grounding her as her breath came ragged. The weight of betrayal crushed her chest, but somewhere beneath it was a flicker of understanding. Pike wasn't boasting. He looked like a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't shake. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, tears brimming. "Because I wanted you to have peace," Pike murmured, his voice breaking. "You deserved better than the truth." Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the office clock. Evelyn's grip on her rifle loosened. For the first time, she didn't know who the enemy truly was. The choice. The dawn broke with a bitter chill, casting Ashwood in muted shades of gold and gray. Evelyn stood alone outside the sheriff's office, Pike's confession echoing in her ears. Samuel's lifeless face burned into her memory. Her hands, still stained faintly red, gripped the rifle tighter than she realized. The street was empty, save for the wind-stirring bits of tumbleweed. The saloon was quiet. The blacksmith's shop shuttered. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Rafe emerged from the shadows of an alley, his hat low, his expression unreadable. "You can't stay here," he said softly, stepping closer. "Crane will come for you next. He won't forgive what happened last night." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes hollow yet blazing with a quiet fury. "Then let him come," she said, voice steady. "I've got nothing left to lose." Rafe studied her a moment, the hardened edge in his gaze softening. "You still have something," he murmured. "Your life, your land. Samuel died trying to protect you. Don't throw it away." Evelyn's throat tightened. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, like a stone. She'd spent years building this life, this ranch, this home, and now it was soaked in blood and secrets. She thought of Pike, of his weathered face as he confessed, of the sorrow in his voice when he said he'd answer to God. She thought of Crane, who would soon tighten his grip around Ashwood until nothing was left. Justice seemed like a hollow dream, survival the only path left. "Tell me," she whispered, staring at Rafe. "If I walk away, if I bury this truth, does that make me as guilty as them?" Rafe met her gaze, his jaw tense. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but guilt's a burden the living carry, and the dead, they don't care one way or another." She closed her eyes, Samuel's voice ringing in her mind. "Protect yourself." By midday, she and Rafe were at her ranch, packing what little she could carry. The house felt like a mausoleum, the ticking clock on the mantel marking the end of everything she'd known. She paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time. Her hand lingered on the door frame, tracing the grooves Thomas had carved when building the cabin. Tears welled, but she wiped them away. "Evie," Rafe called softly from the wagon, "it's time." She nodded and stepped out, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. Ashwood wasn't a town anymore, it was a wound, and she had no choice but to let it heal without her. Resolution and legacy. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Ashwood, its wheels crunching over the dry earth. Evelyn sat beside Rafe, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun bled into a sky of fire and ash. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, open and unyielding, offering both freedom and exile. Behind them, the faint silhouette of her homestead stood against the fading light, smoke still curling from the barn's charred remains. She didn't look back again. Some things were too heavy to carry twice. They rode in silence for miles, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Rafe's face was stoic, but his eyes flicked toward her often, like he was afraid she might shatter without warning. She clutched Samuel's bandana in her lap. The blood dried to a stiff rust color. Her heart ached with a grief too deep for tears, but beneath it, there was a flicker of resolve. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the Carter land, night had fallen. Evelyn asked Rafe to stop. She climbed down from the wagon, boots sinking into the soft dirt, and stood staring out over the valley. The house was nothing more than a dark outline now, a shadow of memories. She could almost hear Samuel's laughter echoing from the barn, Thomas's voice calling her name at dusk. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer not for justice, but for peace. "This land has taken too much," she said softly, her voice steady. "Let someone else have it, someone who needs it more." Rafe stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers gently. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to leave it behind," she whispered. "Let it be a place where no one has to bleed for soil anymore." Weeks later, word spread through the valley. The Carter land had been turned into a refuge. Families displaced by Crane's schemes found shelter there, aided quietly by Rafe and a handful of allies Evelyn barely knew. Crane's men stopped riding those plains, whispers of gunmen watching from the hills, keeping them at bay. The homestead Evelyn once called home became a sanctuary, not a graveyard, but the woman who built it was gone. Travelers passing through Ashwood spoke of her sometimes, of the widowed rancher who rode away one autumn night and never returned. And on certain evenings, when the wind howled low through the empty fields, folks claimed they could hear a woman's voice carried across the prairie singing softly, a lullaby for the dead and a promise for the living. Rafe rode beside her into the endless west, neither speaking. They didn't need to. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time, Evelyn felt free.